All right, let's turn in our Bibles to James chapter 1, if you would. James chapter 1 and verse 12. Before I begin a series on Easter in a few weeks, I thought I'd just share some things with you that I thought would help you, and I think this one will. I think everybody wants to be blessed by God. Everybody wants to be happy. That's what the word blessed really means. And we're going to show you what God says about how to be blessed by God. And it's not the way most people think. Now, I know what Psalms 1 says, and it's all true about being blessed by God is by walking with God. But James 1:12 gives us another way to look at it, and I want us to take a look at that today. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Notice that. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Wow. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let's bow together. Lord, thank you for your word. And I thank you that it teaches us some very practical things to help us in life. So Lord, I pray that you would help us today. Many of us struggle sometimes because of the trials, because of the temptations that come our way. So Lord, I pray that we might have a better understanding of what you're looking for and what the outcome is going to be. Speak to our hearts now in your name. Amen. Somebody said one time that some people cause happiness wherever they go, others whenever they go. Met a few people like that too. It's funny, the things that people look for to find happiness. They try all kinds of stuff in this world, but none of it works. And as I was working on this message, that little song that we sing every now and then, it's in our hymn book, Happiness is the Lord, kept coming into my mind, especially that little part of the verse where it says, real joy is mine, no matter if teardrops start. I've found the secret, it's Jesus in my heart. Boy, there's a lot of truth in that little song, that real joy does come and real happiness comes, real blessedness comes from having Jesus in our heart. Now, James here is writing to Christians that are scattered across the Roman Empire. And he includes this little verse here because of what they're going through. They're going through some tough times. They're going through persecution. They're going through a lot of trials and a lot of testing. And James understands that. James knows that they're hurting. They're weeping. Their hearts are broken at times. They're just not sure which way to turn. And so he throws in this little verse, James 1:12, that tells them exactly how to be blessed. It's the path to real happiness. But I got to tell you, it's good news, but there's also some bad news in this verse. The good news is that God's blessing's available to anybody who wants it. The bad news is the blessing comes with a price tag. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. I was just thinking, as I look back at there, I was at a church the other day that didn't have a clock in the auditorium. Can you imagine that? I thought about maybe taking that one down and putting a calendar up. So at least I'll know what day it is as I go along. You're fortunate. I try to follow the clock just because we're on TV, and I try to make things a little bit easier for Chuck. Otherwise, he's got to frantically start cutting and working. But Chuck, today, I don't think you're going to win. Just thought I'd tell you, all right? Let me give you the 3 steps to God's blessings found in this verse. First of all, we're to endure our trials. He said, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Now, what does James mean by the word temptation? It's the same Greek word that's translated in verse 2 where it says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations. It's a word that means not just the kind of tempting that you think of, but also trials. Because folks, all trials have an element of temptation to them. When I'm going through a trial, I'm tempted to turn my back on God. When I'm going through a trial, I'm tempted to try to fix it all by myself. And yet while all trials have an element of temptation, all temptation has an element of trials. When you yield to temptation, there's consequences, which are trials, that's going to come into your life. But the most important word, I believe, here is found, as you look at it, in verse 12, blessed is the man that endureth. Endureth. He's saying, when trials and when temptations come our way, we've got to remain steadfast. We've got to remain firm. Now, let's face it, having trials may not seem like a blessing at the time, but we've still got to remain and endure those. And when we endure the trials and when we endure the temptation, that's when the blessings come, only as we get through it. Remember what he said in verse 2 about count it all joy? That sounds kind of strange. He says a man's blessed who has endured temptations. And here he says count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations. James is teaching us that it's absolutely possible that the experience that is currently trying your faith will ultimately bring happiness and bring blessings to your life. So when difficulties come, how do you pray? How do you react? How do you respond? I mean, let's face it, when things are going really good, the sky's blue, you got plenty of money in the bank, you're healthy, your children are obedient, then you know it's somebody else's family. No, but when those things are going on, you're tempted not to have faith because, hey, I've got everything. What I need to have faith for. And God knows that. And by the way, when things are going good, it's easy to praise the Lord then. But it's when things get tough. It's when our physical health is not there. It's when you run out of month before you run out of money. It's when you've got problems with your family. That's when faith is not an option. It becomes a necessity. Lord, I need your help. Lord, I don't know what the doctors are saying. I don't understand it, but I know that you're in charge and I trust you. Lord, I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent. I don't know how I'm going to pay the utilities. I don't know how I'm going to make it. That's when God says, trust him. Now, some of us, I believe, are like some hunters I read about that wanted to cash in on a bounty of $5,000 for capturing wolves alive. And so Sam and Jed just turned into fortune hunters. Day and night, they scoured the mountains and the forests looking for these very valuable wolves. One night, they were exhausted and they fell asleep, dreaming of their potential fortune in this little cabin where they were. Sam had worked very hard, and he got up. He said, there's got to be more wolves out there. We've just got to get them. So he got up in the middle of the night and took off. Pretty soon, he wakes Jed up screaming and hollering, Jed, open the door, open the door, open the door. So Jed opens the door and a wolf runs in. Sam shuts the door and stays outside, says, there, he's yours. Sometimes we do that with our trials, like you take my trial and I want nothing to do with it. You know what, folks? There are some things we need to understand about trials and temptations. First of all, things to know about temptation. God does not tempt anyone. Look at verse 13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God himself does not tempt you. Secondly, to kind of explain that, God allows us to be tempted. He allows us to be tempted, but everything has to go through him. It has to go through his hands, through his fingers. Satan wants to tempt you. God may say, fine, you can do this, but you can't do that. But it goes through God's hands, but God's not doing the tempting. God's saying, you know what? She needs to get her faith strengthened. So I'm going to allow her to go through this. Go ahead, Satan. There's a limit to what you can do. It has to go through his hands. Temptation presents a choice. We don't have to give in to it. That's why verse 12 says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. I hear guys all the time say, well, I just can't help it. Yes, you can. You can say no. You don't want to say no. When sin comes along and temptation comes along, it's not that you can't. People say, well, it's not physically possible. Yes, it is. It's called no. It's called saying no and not doing it. Is it easy? No, it's not. Will it hurt sometimes? But God says you can avoid temptation. It presents a choice. You make the choice. The person that says, you know what? I don't care how hard the struggle, I'm going to get through this, and I'm not going to give in to it. God says that's the person that I bless. Then fourth, God will help us concerning the right choice. Paul told us in Corinthians that he is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Notice it doesn't say that God will not allow you to be tempted. It says God's going to allow you to be tempted. but not more than you can handle. And when that temptation comes, God's going to show you how to get away from it. God's going to be telling you on the inside, just say no and walk away. Just say no and walk away. It's not always easy. My wife loves to bake, and I love her for loving to bake, except that when she bakes it, it sits on the counter in the kitchen, and it talks to me. She did a lot of baking yesterday because our Sunday school class is having lunch afterwards, and she made some stuff for the grandkids and made a coffee cake just for her son, Jason. And I came home and I said, now I know what the cookies and all that's for. What about that coffee cake? She said, well, that's Jason's favorite coffee cake. And I said, you mean we can't have any? And she said, well, you can have a piece. So I went and got a piece, and she went in and got a piece. She got a piece, I got a piece. Now, I could have walked up to that coffee cake and I could have said, you evil coffee cake, there ain't no way. And I should have, but I didn't. And so God's got to give me a way now through that temptation, because now I got to knock off the pounds. Some people look at rich stuff and gain 5, I gain 10. And when I eat it, it's 20. So a lot of exercise to do. But God will help us concerning the right choice. Temptation is also a choice that brings out what is in our hearts. Look at verse 14. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Did you catch that? Folks, God says the only reason you're being tempted is that in your heart, it's what you want to do. Even though you know it's wrong, you want to go that direction. Even though you know it's wrong, it's what you want to do. And you're being enticed by your own lusts. Now, the only way to avoid it is to say no and walk away from it. The last thing is this: we will never get beyond temptation in this life. Paul also said in 1 Corinthians 10, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. All of us are going to fall from time to time. All of us are going to trip over our big fat feet and fall into temptation at one time or another. It's just going to happen. It's called being human. It's nothing to be proud of. It's just a fact. And when it does happen, we have to go to God for help. I remember reading about a young Christian who was a slave to a rich man, and the rich man was always telling him that his Christianity wasn't doing him any good. He'd say, you're always telling me Satan's after you, and you got a constant battle with him. He said, you know what, Satan never bothers me, so that Christianity must not be doing you any good. And the poor young Christian he didn't have any answer for that. Well, one day they went out hunting. And the hunter got out his shotgun, and he was looking for some ducks, and he fired, and he killed some and wounded a couple of them. And he said, go out there quick and get the ones that are wounded so they don't get away. So the young Christian went out and comes back with a couple of wounded ducks, just laughing to himself. And he said, what are you laughing about? He said, you know what? I've got the answer to that big question. He said, what big question? About why Satan bothers me and doesn't bother you. He said, what is it? He said, well, let me tell you why Satan doesn't bother you. Because you're dead to God like those ducks out there. He goes after the live ones like me. Now think about that for a moment, folks, because that's exactly what he does. If you're already dead to Christ, you don't know him, and you're not living for him, he doesn't need to bother you. He's got you. But it's the ones who have trusted Christ, the ones who want to live for him, that he keeps wounding. They're the ones that he goes after. They're the ones that he tries to cripple. There's the one that he tries to draw down. Temptation is something that a Christian has to fight with as long as he is here on this earth. And folks, if you're not being tempted, there is a very good chance it's because you're already doing what the devil wants you to do, so he's got no need to bother you. When temptation comes, this blessed man will stand and fight. He doesn't give in to fear. He doesn't flinch when the battle gets hot. He stands and fights. But God also tells us that he can deliver us in two different ways. Sometimes God delivers us from temptation. It's like I looked at those the cookies, those little peanut butter cookies with a big chocolate drop right in the middle, and I looked at that and she said, those are for church. Well, that was my answer. I was being kept from that temptation. The coffee cake didn't have a lid on it. It was just sitting there talking to me. Come and get me. And so I knew I had a chance at that one, but not the cookies. Now, God will sometimes keep us away from things. God will sometimes say, you're not going there if I got to break your legs. He'll keep us from it. But sometimes God protects us through the temptation. He gives us what we need to go through the hard times. Now, although most of us would rather that God deliver us from temptation, the truth is God often just has to protect us through the temptation. We get ourselves into it and God says, all right, you call on me and we're going to work through this thing together. I'm going to help you. I'm going to be there for you. But there's just no way to avoid the trials and temptations that come with living in a fallen world. It goes with it. We don't like it. That's just the way it is. It's a part of life, and we have to deal with it. When Helen passed away and Alan had called me over, we were talking, and he made a comment to me. He said, you just never think it's going to happen. Even though they tell you it's going to happen and they tell you it's coming, you never think it's really going to happen. But it does happen. It happens because we live in a fallen world. And God wants us to spend our time walking with Him. And to do that, He has to take us through the trials. Now, James doesn't offer us any schemes that are going to enable us to avoid the troubles that come our way. And he also doesn't show us any shortcuts on how to get out of them quickly. But he does point out that God promises a blessing to those who will endure the temptation with grace, with dignity, and fortitude. While we hear people testify about the blessings of health or the blessings of their family, I have yet to have somebody stand up and say, I want to thank God that I lost my job. I just haven't heard that yet. And yet, even though it may be a trial, it also may end up being a blessing for you. And we ought to be thanking God even during the tough times. Now, James is not telling us we got to stand up and say, I thank God I just lost my job. But he is saying that when those burdens hit, we've got to trust God, and He'll get us through them. All right, the second step, is that we are then approved by God. Verse 12 says, for when He is tried. For when He is tried. Just stop right there. Tried speaks of the process of testing something in order to prove it. You know what? Life is nothing but a series of tests. You go to kindergarten, first grade, you start having tests, and you just keep on having tests. You get through grade school, you get through high school, you get through college, you go to work, they still want to give you tests. And you're taking tests to improve this and to prove that, to get this license and that license, to get this promotion and that promotion. Life is full of tests. Some of them we pass, some of them we fail. James wants us to know that standing strong during the hard times brings a reward. He says, we'll be approved by God. We'll pass the test. I think most of us worry too much about what others think about us and not enough about what God thinks about us. God uses the trials and for the express purpose of building our faith and building our character. It's got to be tested to be proven genuine. I remember hearing the story of Will Rogers one time, who was a famous comedian back before our time. But he was known not just as a man of laughter, but he also had a heart that caused him to weep. One day, he was at the Barry Institute in Los Angeles. It's a hospital that specializes in rehabilitating polio victims and people with broken backs and other extreme handicaps. And he had everybody laughing. The patients were really in a bad condition, but they were laughing as well. Suddenly, he left the platform and went into the restroom. Well, the guy who brought him there was kind of concerned, so he went in to check on him, and there was Will Rogers leaning against the wall, sobbing like a child. So the guy just gently closed the door and stood guard of it until he heard him moving, and then he walked back in so he wouldn't see him. Will Rogers left the bathroom, came back in, got back up on the platform, and began telling jokes once again. You know what, folks? If you want to learn what a person's really like, ask him 3 questions. What makes him laugh? What makes him angry? And what makes him weep? I hear people saying often that we ought to be practicing a more militant Christianity. Yet, James 1:20 says that the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. By acting mad and angry and moving forward like a vicious army, that's not going to do the job. What the world needs today is not anger. What the world needs is anguish. It needs God's people crying, like Moses when he came down off the mountain, saw his people in idolatry and broke the tablets in anger and wept in anguish over what was going on with them. It's like Jesus when he walked in the temple and had to cleanse the temple of the money changers because they turned the holy place into a place of commerce and of business. And that's all people were concerned about. You know what? It's easy to get angry about somebody else's sins, but it's not so easy to look at our own sins and get angry and then weep over them. I was reminded when I lived in South Carolina, we used to pick on the Tar Heels of North Carolina, and I never knew what it stood for. Till finally one of the men in our church explained it to me. There's several explanations, but this is the one that's most accepted. It was a nickname that came during the Civil War. It seems like a large group of Confederate soldiers retreated during a battle when things got tough, leaving the North Carolina soldiers alone. And so supposedly the North Carolina soldiers threatened to put tar, because it's plentiful in North Carolina, to put tar on the heels of the rest of the Confederate soldiers so they couldn't run away. And that's where you get the name Tar Heel. Well, what James is saying is we all need to be a little bit tar-heeled today. When the battles come, when the struggles come, when the trials come, we've got to stand firm. We can't just keep trying to run away. You can't run away from problems. You can't run away from troubles. You've got to deal with them, and you've got to go to God with them. Thirdly, this is the good part. Then we'll receive the crown of life. He shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. We're promised that one day we're going to trade the old cross, or the old cross, in for a crown. Now, the crown James is referring to is the victor's crown, which was a garland wreath that would be placed around the head of somebody in honor of a victory in the Greek Olympic Games. It's an honor for those who paid the price in the hard times of discipline and practice, getting in shape and working at it to finally have victory. Now let me tell you something very simple. The Christian life is hard. I know that's not good salesmanship, but it is. Sometimes it's very hard. And it's better that we know it so that we're not surprised and not overwhelmed when the tough times come. Think about this. When you got saved, Satan really got angry. He had you where he wanted you. Now he doesn't have you anymore. You don't belong to him anymore. He's mad. He's upset. And he constantly is throwing his demons at you to try to destroy your testimony, to try to take away your joy, to try to keep you from living for God. And he'll give you all kinds of excuses not to do right and not to live for the Lord because he's lost you. He's upset about it. And that makes the Christian life hard. But secondly, God's policy is victory. God intends for us to fight through to victory, to wear the victor's crown. But it's not going to come without toil and struggle and pain and loss. The song Amazing Grace says, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far. Grace will lead me home. That's the testimony of the slave trader who got saved and wrote that song. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I've already come. Notice, grace brought me safe thus far. That means I know I've got more dangers, more toils, more snares to deal with, but grace is going to be good enough, and it's going to get me through it. If life were easy, we'd be tempted to think we don't need God. And so life is not easy because we do need him. Let me close with this. I remember the story of Henry Morrison and his wife. They were missionaries to Africa. They'd been over there for 40 years, and I think only had one furlough the whole time. Finally, they were coming back to the States. They were in their 80s, and they were aboard a ship that sailed home along with the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, who was returning from a hunting expedition. As they pulled into the New York harbor, the president was greeted with a huge fanfare. There was a band playing. There was a big crowd gathered. They were cheering, applauding, just anxious that the president made it back in one piece. They were all excited. And finally, Morrison was just standing there with his wife at the railing looking around and realized that while everybody was excited to see the president, there was nobody there to meet him. And he was angry. He was upset. He thought, the president returns home from a hunting trip, and great crowds come out there to greet him. I return home after giving my life to a far greater cause than a hunting trip, and there's nobody here to meet me. And he said, I was really getting angry and pent up when suddenly the Lord seemed to say, but Henry, you're not home yet. You're not home yet. Folks, life here may not be easy. One day we're going to pull into heaven's harbor, and the days of trial will be over. God's going to give us that victor's crown if we've endured the trials and temptations. We're not going to hang on to it long, because with all the crowns that God gives out, we're all going to take them off our heads, and we're going to cast them at His feet, because He's the one that made it possible. He's the one that gets us through the trials and through the struggles. You want to be blessed? It's not easy. You've got to get through the trials, through the tribulations, through the struggles. You're going to have to cry the tears. Your heart's going to ache. You're going to have the pain. It's a part of it. But God says, if you'll do it, I'll bless you. I'll bless you here, and I'm going to bless you in heaven with a crown.